Hello, my loves. Today we're going to look at some more Reddit stories, and if you've enjoyed a Reddit story, why don't you consider hitting the subscribe button? Maybe that's the notification bell too, and let's start with today's story. First horror story, hope you like it. Set in the sun-setting town Salem Ally, a curious toddler is hanging out with the friendly neighbors in the cozy, warmly lit kitchen. The aroma of freshly baked cookies fills the air, adding to the pleasant ambience. However, something feels slightly off, creating a subtle unease that lingers in the background. Alexis Ally's mom, with her gentle smile, goes outside for a breath of fresh air and takes a leisurely stroll in the yard. As we all get distracted by the laughter and chatter, Alexis remains in the yard, and suddenly, an eerie feeling creeps over me, making me open a window and call her name. To my surprise, a distant, unfamiliar voice from the neighbor's house starts yelling Alexis's name, jolting us with its volume and urgency. It echoes through the tranquil evening, sending shivers down our spines. Alexis eventually returns inside, but her behavior becomes oddly robotic and distant, almost as if she's in a trance. As darkness falls, the town's atmosphere becomes mysterious and intriguing. The warm hues of the setting sun give way to the cooler, darker tones of dusk. The air carries a gentle, cool breeze that rustles the leaves on the trees, creating a soothing melody. The distant sounds of crickets and frogs serenade us, their rhythmic calls adding to the tranquility. I notice a faint, mysterious glow surrounding Alexis in the yard, casting an otherworldly aura around her small form. Her movements appear ethereal and disconnected from reality, further adding to the unsettling scene. The situation becomes more mysterious and alarming as the darkness envelopes the town. Eerie sounds echo in the distance, and multiple voices call out Alexis's name, making us all fear something supernatural might be at play. The calls are a strange mixture of echoes and reverberations, creating an almost haunting effect that lingers in the air. Despite our fear, we decide to stick together and confront the unknown. Inside the house, strange occurrences intensify, with flickering lights casting dancing shadows on the walls, adding to the unease. The mysteriously turned-on TV displays distorted images and symbols, accompanied by an unsettling, static noise. We attempt a protective ritual to help Alexis, our voices rising and falling in a harmonic rhythm, but the tension in the house rises with every chant. The sound of our collective breaths becomes synchronized, matching the beating of our hearts, both resolute and apprehensive. As the ritual reaches its peak, the room trembles, and the candle's gentle flickering intensifies, casting a mesmerizing glow that illuminates the room with a soft, warm light. The scent of the candle's wax mingles with the lingering aroma of cookies, creating a unique and surreal olfactory experience. We face a palpable sense of danger, but as suddenly as it began, everything stops. The room falls into silence, broken only by our heavy breathing. The glow around Alexis disappears like a fading dream, leaving us in awe and wonder. With relief, we see her come back to her senses, unaware of what just transpired. Her eyes, previously distant and glazed, now sparkle with innocence and curiosity, as if nothing unusual happened. From that unsettling night onwards, our bond as neighbors grows stronger, as we remain vigilant in protecting each other from the mysterious forces that may lurk in the shadows of Salem. The town's secrets continue to puzzle us, and we now keep a watchful eye on the setting sun, knowing that darkness can awaken strange occurrences. Ghost in the bedroom. It was a small, unsuspecting bedroom, decorated with soft purple walls, white trim, and a built-in with drawers on either side. The full-sized bed sat high in the center of the room, perpendicular to a small crowded closet and a single window, with just enough space to walk around. The room was nestled on the corner of a second-story brick house, the window overlooking a gentle rolling hill carved into two by a two-lane road. Behind the house, within 50 feet of the sloped, uneven backyard, lie a dense forest that stretched on for miles. Inside this small room, I found refuge. I was a typical teenager, rebellious, moody, and given frequent conflict with my family. I preferred to be alone. Each night, I would retreat into my room, shut the lights, and dial into my laptop. The laptop was merely a vessel for a hobby that I was indulging in. Inspired by a film class, I began watching all kinds of movies, both old and new, from the comfort and solitude of my bed. In that dark room, the world seemed to melt away as the screen danced with images of other worlds. Their stories distracted me from the chaos and emotion that simmered inside of me. Weeks passed and a routine began to take hold. Many times, after leaving the room for a bathroom break or a quest for the perfect snack, I'd discover my cat, Emmy, must have snuck in behind me. She was a short-haired black cat, impossible to see in the dark behind the screen, but I could feel her jump onto the bed and settle into the corner. One particular night, I retired early and it was not long into my second film before I felt the familiar weight at the edge of the bed. Smiling, I shifted myself to give her room and nestled back into the sheets, but was abruptly startled by my door whipping open. My mom stared into the room, looking visibly confused. "Did you just walk into your room?" she asked me. "No." I responded hesitantly, "I've been in here for a couple hours." She took several paces into the room, looking around the edges of the bed, and pressed again, "Do you have a friend over?" "No, it's just me and Emmy in here." "Why? What's wrong?" She turned on the light, and I sat up and looked down at my bed to see a large indent, still creased from the weight of her, was empty. I looked to both sides of the room, but she isn't there. Puzzled, I look back at my mom to see a fearful look in her eyes. "I watched a girl walk into your room. I saw her in the hallway." "Are you sure it wasn't you? No one is in here?" "I'm sure," I answer her. Fear began bubbling up deep inside of me, but I swallow hard to try to force it back down. "Okay. Never mind, then," my mom says dejectedly and closes the door as swiftly as she opened it. Stunned, I sat quietly in the darkness, illuminated solely by the dim light of my computer. The energy of the room seemed to have shifted. It no longer felt comfortable and safe. I felt scared. Who could she have seen, I wondered. Was it real, or a trick of the eye? And where did Emmy go? My stomach twisted with anxiety, unsure of what to believe. I took a deep breath and pressed play on the laptop. This will help keep my mind off things, I thought to myself. 10. Maybe 20 minutes go by and I feel the familiar weight press into the edge of the bed. Pausing the movie, I sit up and whisper, "There you are," as I begin reaching for her. My hands pad around the blanket, but I don't feel her. I climb out of the bed to turn on the light when I suddenly realize that my door is closed. She couldn't have gotten in. Eyes wide, I dart to the light and switch it on to find the indent slowly leaving the bed. Emmy isn't in the room. Chills seemed to dance across my skin, giving rise to a sea of goosebumps as the realization seeped in. In an instant, I shut the lights back out. Diving back into bed, I slammed my laptop shut and pulled the sheets over my head. I squeezed my eyes shut as I heard my bed creak under the weight of it. Turning my back to the edge, I willed myself to sleep. It can't hurt me if I don't give it the energy, I told myself. My blood ran cold as I felt a hand on my shoulder, tugging me, beckoning me, to look at it. The grip seemed to grow stronger, and from the corner of my eye, a dark figure towered over the bed. I whispered over and over for hours for it to leave, that it was not welcome. I whispered until exhaustion won the war versus fear, and the world went still. It was the last night I ever stayed in that small, purple room. Story: My encounter with a black-eyed child. I know what you might be thinking, she's just trying to get likes. Well, you're wrong. This is true, and it happened to me yesterday night. It was a little past midnight, so I guess it was this night, and I had woken up to a banging sound on my door. But before we get to the scary stuff, let me tell you what black-eyed children are. Black-eyed children are children with pale skin and black eyes. Not just the pupil that is black, their eyes are all black, no whites or anything. Just black. They go to houses or cars and bang on their windows or doors. When you open it, they will ask, "Can I come in?" But, whatever you do, don't let them come in. They usually appear in a group of 2 at night so no one can see their eyes. They will look like completely normal innocent children who are lost and need to come in. If you let them in, then you will experience bad luck for the rest of your life, and there is absolutely no way of getting rid of it. So anyway, back to the story. I woke up to the sound of loud banging on my door. My parents were out voting, and my sister was still asleep. I went downstairs quietly so I wouldn't wake my sister up. I had cameras, but I decided not to look at them. When I looked through the little peeping hole on the door, I saw children. They didn't look quite as normal though. The little boy, around 8 years old, had these weird shoes and outfit that someone in like the 40s would wear, or just in the 1900s. The point is he dressed old-fashioned. The girl, around 6, did not look so better. She had this haircut that a woman would wear in the 90s and an outfit that a woman would wear in the 70s. Besides that, they looked perfectly normal. Are you lost? I asked. Our parents will be here soon. They both said in unison, do you need anything? Can we come in? Right away I knew that something was off about these kids. Not just the fact that they were dressed weirdly, but the fact that their voices were off. They had voices that number 8-year-old or 6-year-old should have. I suddenly felt dizzy and I knew that something demonic was in these kids. If your parents are almost here, then can't you just wait out here? I asked. It was a perfectly sweet neighborhood and not a robbery or anything had ever went on. I never even ever saw a shady person walk around here. Can we come in? They asked once more. But, this time, they weren't asking. They were starting to get angry. No, you may not. I yelled. I know this sounds bad that I am saying that a little kid that's lost can't come in my house, but there was something off about these kids. That yell woke up my sister and she turned on the light, which helped me see that these kids had black eyes. I screamed and shut the door in their face. My sister asked what was going on and who was that and why I yelled. I told her to just go to bed and don't worry about it. She did as I asked. The kids eventually left, but they did do some damage to my house when I shut the door. They ripped some plants and they cracked the window. Later that night, I did some research on them and I found out that they can only come into your house if they get permission. I also found out that it's the same with demons. Like if you summon them and play spiritual games and stuff. If you moved into a house and they were already there, then that's because someone else previously allowed them in or the place was abandoned. There is a slight chance they will come back soon and I'll be ready. When the kids left, they went into a black car with 2 tall dudes in suits. Just remember, if you ever see a kid with black eyes and pale skin coming towards your house or car, don't let them in. Story, Night Walker. As the day comes to an end on Spring High School, 2 boys, John and Paul, were exiting the front gate. The boys were heading to John's house to hang out, have fun and play video games to celebrate the final day of school. As the night went on, the boys had more and more fun, happy that summer vacation starts the next day. As the final light gets snuffed out by the dark of the night sky, putting an end to the day, the boys tell each other ghost stories. One of the stories catches Paul's attention, cause the story John told was about a dark 6.9 red eyes, white teeth man. Paul stared at John with a terrifying look on his face. John notices the color running out of Paul's face. John reaches over to shake Paul to see if he was all right. John shook Paul 3 times to snap him out of it. Paul raised his head and asked John in a terrifying, fearful voice, "Where did you hear that story from?" Paul and John became friends over this past year, so they don't know that much about each other's past. When John told the story, terrifying and violent memories, John looked surprised and with a confused look he replied, "One of my old friends told me and found it off the internet." Why? Look like you seen a ghost. Paul thought to himself the ghost would have been more fun to miss with him, but no. Paul looked at John and told him everything. How the story his old friend told wasn't just a story but real. Paul continues by saying the last person that hears has to tell it to another person by midnight. John looks at Paul with concern and with a little fear in his voice. What happens to the person who heard it last but can't tell the story after midnight? Paul raises his head with a serious, frightening look. Paul said, goes missing and appears as a corpse. The room was dead silent, not a word was said. You can even hear the mosquitoes tapping on the window, tap tap tap, then a loud alarm from John's cell phone ripped through the silence. John grabs his phone to shut off his alarm. John takes a second look at his phone, and he notices the time. John looks up at Paul with a dreadful look. Paul stared into John's eyes, then turns the phone around, presenting Paul the time on his phone. The time read 11:15 p.m. Paul's eyes widened when he saw the time. Paul grabs his belongings to run out of John's house, but John stops him and yells out, "What now?" Paul replied, "There is something I left out. If I make it home before midnight on my own, I see another day." John looked confused and spit out, "Explain," but the short version. Paul replied, "If the last person that heard the story can't find another to tell it to anyone, the only safe place is that person's home." John looked at Paul and yelled, "Well, what are you waiting for? Go, get out, go home." Paul grabbed all of his belongings and ran out of John's house. I ran down the street as fast as my legs could take me. I felt the exhaustion kicking in and collapsed to my knees as my hands slapped the ground. I took out my phone and glanced at the time, 15 minutes till midnight. I don't have enough time to make it home. What do I do? I raise my head to see there's a park on my left-hand side. I tried to avoid all parks in fear as I stood at the entrance looking at the park. It barely has any lights working. In the darkness, it looks like a dark figure standing along the way. I have no choice but to cross. As I'm crossing, I hit the middle of the park, the most creepiest area where I stand. In the middle of the park, the silence surrounds me. Not even the breeze of the wind made a noise. As I'm standing in the middle of the park, the surrounding silence was hypnotizing. It felt time was standing still, then a roaring sound shattered the silence. My phone's alarm went off, breaking the trance that the darkness and silence had on me. I ripped my phone out of my pocket to check the time. My eyes widened. It was past midnight. The thoughts flooding through my mind, "Oh shit, gotta get home, gotta get the fuck out of the darkness." As I was about to put my body into motion, I saw in the corner of my eye a shadow figure materialize. I turned my head, and the figure took the shape and transformed into an old man. The fear ran down my face with the thoughts of where did he come from, how come I didn't hear his footsteps, and why is he waving at me? Fuck no. I took off running in the opposite direction, heading towards the nearest exit. Running through the darkness, seeing barely any lights, approaching the exit that leads out into the street. Passing through the gate of the park, running out onto the street, not paying attention, smacking into a parked car. Picking myself up off the ground, thinking I got away. I think I'm going to make it. I raise my head, and down the street the old man I saw in the park waving, standing at the end of the street. My eyes filled with terror, my body told me to run. I ran back into the park thinking if I run through the park, cutting him off and go passing him, I can make it home. Passing through the middle of the park again, heading towards another exit, hope and thinking that this has to work. Ran back onto the street using the second exit of the park. Full sprint in motion, I ran out of the park onto the street, not stopping, heading down the street. Passing where the old man was equally standing in the street on the other side of the park. With the continuing motion, my body is on autopilot, running down the street thinking I'm clever, I lost him, but I was dead wrong. Every turn I made, the old man appeared even more creepier, sinister, threatening, terrifying. Every time I come face to face with the old man, he became more monsterized and his eyes turned a bright red. Then the old man, now the monster, started chasing after me. My body was in flight mode. I took off running, my energy, my strength, and my body depleted as well. It was falling apart. But the fear of death was plaguing my mind. Only one thought ran through my mind: I have to survive, I'm going to live. In the long distance I can see my house. I thought I'm going to make it, but there weren't any lights on. A thought enter, my parents weren't home. I'm running up the stairs, throwing my bag in front of me, digging for my house keys to unlock the front door. I stuck my keys to unlock the door. I violently ripped open the front door, falling inside. The monster was chasing me before the monster realized that I fell into my house. I kicked the door shut, slamming it into the monster's face. Safe inside my house, I ran to my door, hitting all the locks on the door. Walking through the house, not a soul in sight. I walked up the stairs to enter the bathroom to turn on the shower as the water was heating up. I left to enter my bedroom. As I entered my room, I hit the switch to turn on the lights, but nothing happened. I raised my head to look at the light fixture. As I'm staring at the light fixture, I heard my door slowly creaking, moving, then heavy breathing piercing the darkness. I slowly turn to see where it's coming from, two red eyes floating in the darkness. The monster approaches, staring down at me face to face. It raises its arm, then it grabs me by my throat. I'm trying to fight it, but all my strength and stamina bled dry. It was getting harder to breathe, feeling my body shutting down. My sight was getting blurry, and right before the darkness covered my eyes, glanced over at my clock. I saw in blue numbers the time. At 1:10 a.m. I heard a roar from the monster. The morning sun breaks through the glass window of Paul's bedroom. The only sound echoing through the house was running water. The shower that ran on all through the night echoing. In Paul's room, his phone went off screaming where he dropped it. The phone rang and rang every time it stopped. The calls automatically went to voicemail. On the caller ID was John trying to get in touch. John kept calling, hoping that Paul would pick up. John kept calling and calling. Eventually Paul's phone went dead. John stared at his phone, a worried look ran across his face. Story: Two Little Girls. Springfield, Ohio, August of 1992. I was an 8-year-old that particular summer. My parents only recently started letting me go outside by myself, and I was taking full advantage, but I had rules to follow, or my rights would be immediately revoked. For one, I couldn't leave my family's property. We kids had a large backyard with 2 outdoor playsets with slides and swings, so entertainment wasn't an issue, even if I had to keep it contained to the yard. Mom said it was for our own protection. She said that strangers can't be trusted, so we had to stay in the backyard, and never play in front or by the side of the road where we could easily be snatched. I didn't always obey this, but I never got caught either. This changed quickly one wet, balmy summer afternoon when my mom got word that 2 little girls about my age were missing. They had last been seen at the bakery just down the street from our house while buying sweets, their bikes discarded by the side of the road as if the girls were snatched. Or so that's what my mother told me. After a search, the girls, Free Morrow and Martha Leach, aged 11 and 12, were found dead in a gruesome, horrible fashion. I won't go into it here because the awful things they did to those girls isn't the point of this story. However, the shit I'm not talking about here is easily found online with just a quick search. Just know though, that the details are fucked up and it's not for the faint of heart. The parents of Springfield changed that day. All of my newly given freedoms were revoked. After all, the killer, or killers, were still at large. For all my mom knew, it could have been one of our neighbors. She didn't trust anyone anymore. I didn't understand it at the time, but as a parent now, I fully get it. If I were my mom, I would have locked my children down, as well. What else could she have done? There were so few options available. Who else was going to protect us if not our own parents? Everyone else was too busy trying to figure out who the murderer was. I frankly didn't care at the time who killed them. I only cared that they were dead and not coming back. I didn't know Martha very well, but I was pretty familiar with Free. The girls were a bit older than me, and we didn't share any classes, but I knew Free most through a summer gym program we both attended a month or so earlier. My brain couldn't wrap around it. I kept hearing about the horrible details of their deaths, of the terrible state that the killers left them in, of facts I wasn't mentally prepared for, but had to hear anyway. The news left few details out in those days, and what I didn't fully understand at the beginning of a school day, I was well educated in the schoolyard by the time I got home in the afternoon. 8-year-olds have no business hearing about the cruel ways their playmates' corpses were desecrated, but there I was. I heard the funeral was a real shit show, but I obviously wasn't there for that. My mom had a thing about me and funerals. She didn't think I was ready to go to any until I was well into my teens, and even then, was overprotective in the extreme when I finally went to my first one with her. I thought she was being extra back then, and I was mostly right, but now as an adult, I really do see where she was coming from a lot more than I used to. That said, to be honest, I think going to the funerals might have actually also been beneficial for me, all things considered. I've never been able to fully process their deaths, so maybe being able to say goodbye would have helped, but I have no way of knowing for sure. What I do know was that my mom was sure that she made the right decision when she heard that there were fights and family feuding allegedly taking place during the viewing and burial, but of course, I have no way of knowing if that's true or rumor. Small towns are sadly like that. Folks who weren't even there will claim anything they can to make themselves look more interesting. Meanwhile, some of us truly wish they could have attended, if anything, just for the closure. I didn't even get closure when they caught the killers. I'm not going to name them here, nor give them attention. They don't deserve it. All you need to know is there was a group of middle-aged to old men led by one of their gang of peers. The bastards tried to molest the girls, and when they fought back, they didn't just hurt the girls. They brutalized and destroyed them. There was no excuse for the monstrousness of killing anyone, let alone 2 little girls. There was nothing they could have done to deserve that. I didn't care about the reasons given for the murders. I didn't care what the murderers had to say at the trial. Their confessions meant less than nothing to me. All I cared about was that my friends were dead, and knowing the horrible details weren't going to bring them back. Frankly, hearing the killer's excuses was an exercise in self-harm. One that I refused to subject myself to again. Though I did try to read a book on the murders once, but I never got to finish it. There's actually a really crazy and ironic reason why, too. Fast forward to Christmas of 2005. I was a new mother to a sweet little baby girl, and times were hard. Homelessness was new to me, but I wasn't wearing it well. A local church was offering a free turkey feast and gifts for children at a holiday party, and my friend had invited my daughter, now son, and I to attend as well, despite not being members of the church. Of course, I jumped at the chance, and we all went together, her and her kids, and me and mine. It was lovely at first. My kid got to sit on Santa's lap and received a cute teddy bear and some candy. Then we had the feast, but I ended up realizing my allergen was in every dish, so I pulled out a book to read while I waited for my family to finish eating. I was reading a book written about the murders, which also happened to be in the town it happened in. To be fair, I should have known better, but how was I to guess that I would be sitting at the table of someone directly related to the case? Springfield is a small town, but I never guessed that small. As I was reading, I noticed a guy staring at me. Then my friend told me to put the book away and wouldn't tell me why, but I did as I was told. I still didn't know why she was acting that way while we were leaving after the party, and was alone for a moment in the parking lot having a cigarette before we left when a middle-aged man walked up to me. I said hello, and he responded with, "I bet you want to know what I know about those girls, don't you?" This threw me through a loop. I was like, WTF? Before I could really speak to him, though, my friend grabbed me and my kid and dragged us back to her car, telling us to get in as quickly as possible. Only when we were pulling out did I finally realize exactly what had happened back there. Mrs. J, my friend and driver, told me that was the brother of the head of that killer gang of middle-aged to old men. She asked me what he was saying to me, and when I told her, her face turned white with fear. Needless to say, I wasn't invited back to that church. I never finished the book. It felt weird after that particular encounter. Years passed, and I had almost forgotten about this event. That is until I was at the city library one afternoon before closing time and was gathering my things to leave. I saw the brother of the head murderer and immediately recognized him. There was no mistaking this man. He had a look about him that was hard to forget. Still, I was convinced that he'd never remember me. Not in a million years. That is, until the guy ran up to me, his face glowing with recollection. It was clear he knew exactly who I was and that he wanted to continue with the conversation we were having years before. He looked excited to see me. After a quick greeting, I told him that I had to get going, but he followed me out the door and all the way to the bus stop. I waited there for the bus, listening to his constant reassurance that he didn't know anything and was passed for being a suspect on account of his innocence. It was, Quite frankly, a redneck murder version of Forrest Gump as this strange man blathered on and on about his life, his brother, and how the crime affected his life on that random bus stop bench. The whole exchange was strange in the extreme, but I was patient and polite throughout. Not only to be respectful of another human being, but also, I didn't know this guy. I had no reason to believe I was safe. After all, his brother was literally the most notorious murderer in the entire city. And then it hit me. There would be no way I could get off at my usual stop, because then he'd know where I lived at the time. I didn't know what to do, but I felt extremely uncomfortable. This man would not stop talking. I don't even remember all of what was said years later, but I just know I was unnerved and desperately wanted the social exchange to end as soon as possible. To my horror, it didn't. He followed me to the bus stop where I was to make my transfer to get home. However, when I said my goodbyes as I got on, he got on as well and said he was heading my way. When asked where that would be, he couldn't give me an answer. This is when I was forthcoming with him and said he was making me uncomfortable. I politely and softly explained that I didn't want to talk anymore and would like some quiet time now. Then, I got off a few blocks before my usual stop, and instead of heading home, I walked to the fire station on that route and rang the doorbell. When I turned around to see where he went, the strange man was all the way across the other side of the street as if to avoid me. The fire department was kind and had someone escort me home safely. Never saw him again. Story: my mentally disabled brother spent 3 days in the house with my mother's dead body. He says something inhuman slunk through the house at night. I moved away from my hometown a few years ago. My father had committed suicide when I was a small boy, going out to the barn and shooting himself in the face with a shotgun. I barely remember him still. The only thing that stays with me from that day was my mother's agonized, racking sobs when she found his mutilated body. Sometimes, during nightmares late at night, I still hear those same screams, repeating over and over like a skipping record. My little brother, Charlie, was born with Down syndrome. My mother took care of Charlie by herself since I moved away. I rarely talked to my family, something I feel increasingly guilty about looking back. Unbeknownst to me, my mother had a worsening addiction to pills and alcohol. To this day, I don't know if she intended to kill herself or not. But, after examining her corpse, the medical examiner concluded that she had a lethal combination of benzos, morphine and vodka in her system. When they found her body rotting in the summer heat in her bedroom 3 days later, they said she had one eye half open, her arms still outstretched towards the telephone, as if trying to call for help even in death. The police ended up finding my number a few days later. I lived over 5 hours away, but when I heard Charlie was being kept at the police station, I immediately took the day off of work and headed back towards my hometown of Frost Hollow. I remember driving through the rural town, a place of rolling hills and thick, dark forests, thinking how dead and empty the whole area looked. A lot of the houses that had been there when I was younger had since been demolished or lay barren, dilapidated and rotting. The police station in the center of town seemed to be one of the few places still open. I looked at the shuttered windows lining both sides of Main Street, seeing one out-of-business sign after another. On the bright side, however, there were plenty of parking spots along the cracked, empty streets. I got out of the car, seeing a feral, mange-covered dog ripping through bags of garbage in a nearby alleyway. The sickly sweet smell of decaying trash filled the air, thick and cloying. I entered the glass doors of the police station, finding an old crone pecking at a keyboard behind the front desk. She looked like a twisted dwarf, her eyes magnified to giant orbs behind her glasses. She looked up at me with a pale, bloodless face. "Yes," she said in an annoyed voice. "I'm here to pick up Charlie Benton," I said. The old woman looked behind her, where a tanned woman in a police officer's uniform was leaning against a rusted metal cabinet, looking through a file. "Sergeant Alvarez deals with that," the old woman spat, looking back at her computer. The police officer sighed, looking up at me with humorless eyes. A few moments later, she circled around, coming out the tinted black glass door around the side. The slow, erratic typing of the old woman continued ringing out like the ticking of a failing heart. Sergeant Alvarez had wide, almond-shaped eyes and jet-black hair pulled back in a ponytail. She did not look happy to see me. "You're Dennis?" she asked. I nodded, pulling out my license. She inspected it closely before handing it back to me. "We found your brother in quite a state. He was covered in blood, naked from the waist up, wandering through people's backyards at night. When the police found him, at first he was unresponsive, as if he were sleepwalking or something. His eyes were open, but he was not talking and appeared to be looking at things only he could see. After about 30 seconds of this, they said he appeared to wake up, though he still wasn't giving coherent answers at first. He just kept saying, 'She was walking, she was walking.' Eventually, after a lot of trying, they were able to ask him about why he was wandering at night and why he was covered in injuries and blood. 'Your brother said something kept hurting him in the house at night and that he had to get out. He had marks on his body,' Sergeant Alvarez said, her eyes suspicious. Intelligence gleamed behind them. The strangest thing. It looked like someone had burned hand marks into his back and shoulders. I found this information disturbing on some instinctive, primal level, but I didn't know why. Who could have done that? I asked, confused. She shrugged. Charlie couldn't tell us, she said. Your mother had been dead for 3 days by that point, and the wounds on Charlie's body were fresh. Do you know if there was anyone else who regularly visited or lived in the house with them? I shook my head. My mother had no friends, I said. She was practically a hermit. She used to just stare out the window for hours when I lived there like a zombie. No one ever came to visit her. The black doors swung open again, and Charlie stood there next to a muscular police officer. Charlie's face had his typical vacant stare. Charlie appeared in his mid-20s, a sweaty, lumpy mass of a human being wearing a tight pinky and the brain t-shirt. His enormous belly hung over his belt, his shirt seemingly always pulled up to expose a few inches of naked flesh. He had confused, mud-brown eyes that rarely focused on anything for longer than a few seconds. But there were other times Charlie seemed to have an almost photographic memory, repeating entire conversations in his strange, droning monotone even months after they had taken place. She is dead, he said, his muddy brown eyes unfocused. She is dead. She was walking. I squinted at him, feeling cold dread dripping down my heart. Charlie, buddy, it's okay now, I said, taking a step towards him. He looked up abruptly, seeming to just now realize that I was there. Dennis, he screamed, his enormous belly jiggling as he ran forward. He wrapped his thick arms around me, his face filled with an innocent, childlike excitement. He lifted me off the ground. A breathy exhalation of fetid breath hit me directly in my face. I grunted as he squeezed the air out of my lungs. Charlie was immensely strong and often didn't realize his own strength. You're crushing me, buddy, I grunted in a small, crushed voice. Charlie dropped me back down on the ground. I looked closer at him, seeing healing, sickly wounds peeking above the neckline of his t-shirt. A rainbow of black, purple, and blue marks hung there, formed in the shape of long, twisted fingers. The worst of them had drops of pus falling from the burnt craters in the center. I wondered how many more lay hidden beneath his clothes. Sergeant Alvarez gave me her card, telling me to call her if I found out any more information about the case or if Charlie remembered anything or was able to give more information in the future. I wondered who could have possibly been hurting Charlie. It made me feel sick and angry, thinking of someone following him around, scaring him and attacking him during the night. Charlie already hated and feared the dark as it was, adding another layer of cruelty to the disturbing case. He had feared it ever since he was a small boy. I walked him out of the police station, buckling him into the passenger seat of the car. As I sat down in the driver's seat, he looked over at me. Sweat glistened on his upper lip, and his goofy bowl cut of a haircut was sticking up in random spots. Dennis, I saw her, Charlie said in his flat monotone. She was walking. At night, I heard her feet. In the dark, I heard her feet. Who was Buddy? I asked. Who did that to you? Did someone hurt you during the nighttime? He nodded. A single tear fell from his squinty eyes, dripping down his round face. It wasn't Mom? He shook his head in response. His lips started quivering. He leaned close to me, whispering in a hoarse, terror-stricken voice. The bone-faced woman, he hissed, breaking down in tears. I had contacted a team to remove the soiled items in the master bedroom after receiving a call from the police. The team told me it would be a fairly easy job, and that I would be able to stay in the house later that night. With no other living family except Charlie, I would undoubtedly inherit it anyway, though I had absolutely no intention of keeping it. I wanted to sell it as soon as possible, but I would have to go through everything and decide what, if anything, I wanted to keep. All of Charlie's stuff was also still in the house, which I knew we would need to go through and package regardless. It was a Friday, and I had the weekend off work. My plan was to finish moving everything out of my mother's house that weekend. Charlie and I pulled into the sprawling property that night, turning onto the flat, dirt driveway towards the old colonial. Sharp stones crunched rhythmically under the tires. I took in the sight, the large windows and wrap-around porch of the dark purple house. I saw my childhood neighbor, Sloan Herbick, standing outside on his front lawn. Behind him loomed his Victorian house, a blood-red building of sharp turrets and dark, dusty windows. Sloan Herbick was a strange man in more ways than one. He had been burned horribly as an infant in a crib fire, barely surviving with his life. Melted folds of lumpy scar tissue covered most of his body, including his face and head. Miraculously, he hadn't lost his eyesight, nose, or lips, but both of his ears were missing as well as all the hair on his head except his long, black eyelashes. His horrifyingly scarred body looked nearly as pale as an albino's, but his eyes were as dark as sin. I remembered Sloan as an arrogant, aloof man with no friends, about 10 years older than myself. According to what my mother told me as a teenager, Sloan's mother had gone missing when I was little, during the time when they were constructing our then brand new home in Frost Hollow. By now, I thought, he must be at least 40, though the keloid scars and mutilated ridges of flesh running over his entire body made it impossible to tell. As I got out of the car, I gave a neighborly wave, but Sloan ignored me. He stared fervently down at the hole, slamming the sharp tip of the shovel into the earth over and over again at a frenetic pace. I walked by Charlie's side up the rickety wooden steps to the front porch, pulling the spare house key out of my pocket from so many years ago. With trembling fingers, I slid the key into the lock, finding that my keys still worked, as I knew they would. The door opened onto a dark, sinister hallway. A nauseating odor emanated from the house, blowing out the front door like the rancid breath of some primordial monster. It was the smell of rotting bodies, clotted blood, and infection. It left a slightly sweet aftertaste. Gagging, I flipped on the light switch. I took a step forward, but Charlie didn't follow. He stared up at me with an unusual intensity, taking his huge, round arms and crossing them over his chest. The front of his dirt-caked sneakers came up the perimeter of the threshold, but he refused to go any further. He just shook his greasy, sweat-covered face. "Come on, buddy," I said encouragingly, giving him a wide smile. "What's wrong?" He pointed behind me, down the hallway. I instantly looked over my shoulder, my heart leaping up like a jackrabbit. Having watched far too many horror movies, I expected to see some blood-streaked hag standing there with a face like a skull and an ear-to-ear grin. But the hallway lay empty. "She's still here," Charlie said slowly, his eyes giant, glassy orbs of terror. "She is dead." "Mom's not here, buddy," I answered, ambling back toward him and taking one of his enormous hands in mine. I could feel the width of it, the smooth flatness of his palms except for one thick ridge. "Mom's at the funeral home. We're going to see her Sunday, remember?" Charlie shook his head again, his hair flying everywhere. "This place is bad," he said. "We've got to stay here for the weekend, Charlie," I responded, feeling a rising sense of irritation. "I already explained it all to you. The house is fine." They took the dead body out already, so what's the problem? You'll be with me the whole time. It will be bad, Charlie said, sweating heavily. It won't be scary, buddy. I promise. Looking back, it is hard to imagine any more untrue words than those. Much of the stuff from my mother's room had been taken out by the cleaning team. They told me that some of her fluids had burst from her body, staining the mattress and bed frame with their black rot. Luckily, not much had gotten on the floor, but a small puddle had dripped down. The guest bedroom was directly underneath Mom's room, just a small, square room on the first floor with a bed, a dresser, and a TV. I kept the bedside lamp on all night. On the ceiling of the room, there was a Rorschaching lot of dead, rotted fluids that still needed to be cleaned up. It was about the size of a basketball and looked like an eye. It had a dark, circular spot in the center, followed by thin, black tendrils that cracked their way towards the oval perimeter of the stain. Charlie crawled into bed next to me, putting a heavy, hot hand on my shoulder before falling asleep almost instantly. But I couldn't sleep. After what felt like an eternity, I looked over at the red lights of the alarm clock, seeing it was 3:32 a.m. I swore under my breath, sensing that my insomnia would not leave me alone this weekend in this place of horrors. At exactly 3:33, a jarring mechanical shrieking started outside. I jumped up in bed. Charlie awoke instantly. He sat up so fast that he smacked his head on the wall with a dull bank. What the fuck is that noise? I hissed, jumping out of bed. I looked up at the stain as I went, giving it a distrustful glance backwards. The mechanical caterwauling seemed to be growing louder as I made my way toward the front of the house. I went to the front window, seeing Sloan Herbeck running a wood chipper next to his totally dark house. I could just barely make out his dull silhouette, hearing the din of the constant grinding. Charlie gave an incomprehensible scream in the guest bedroom. I heard his heavy footsteps running toward me. His face was red and flushed, his pupils dilated and frantic. The eye moved, he said, his voice having more emotion than I had heard in it in a long time. I blinked, the fog of sleep still clouding my mind. You mean the stain? I asked, finally figuring out what he was talking about. The stain on the ceiling? He nodded ferociously, bobbing his head up and down quickly. Eventually, I ended up talking Charlie down and getting him back to bed. The stain was still in the same spot, as far as I could tell. Around 4 a.m., the sound of the wood chipper finally died. In the eerie silence of the dark house, I fell into a nightmarish fever dream where I saw women bound with chains in a basement surrounding a mannequin wearing a suit made of human skin. The next morning, I went over to Sloane's house and knocked until he answered. While I waited, I studied the strange gargoyle knocker plastered across the scarlet door. At first, he would only crack it open a fraction of an inch, staring out at me with a single black eye. Can you not run the wood chipper in the middle of the night? I asked, giving him a faint, anxious half-smile. It's keeping me and Charlie from sleeping. I mean, you had the thing going at 3 a.m. last night. A few heartbeats later, the front door flew open. Sloane took a step towards me, until his scarred, alien face stood only inches from mine. It's because of my skin, isn't it? He asked in a hoarse, low voice. He spoke in a strange cadence, mumbling the words in dissonant rhythms. If someone cut your eyes out so you couldn't see how ugly I am, you wouldn't care about the wood chipper anymore, would you? I took a step back, the smile peeling off my face. I reached for the canister of police mace in my pocket, gripping it firmly and putting my hand on the trigger. Sloane, that has nothing to do with that, I answered coldly, narrowing my eyes at him. Don't act like a goddamn psycho. Look, if you keep that shit up, I'll call the cops. Don't fucking do it again. I had no patience for nut jobs like him. He always gave me the creeps. As a kid, someone had gone around pouring bleach into the eyes of people's cats and dogs, blinding them and leading to some getting euthanized. I always suspected Sloane of doing it, though he never got caught. My brother and I spent the rest of that day packing up anything we wanted to take with us, putting it in boxes and labeling it. Charlie didn't have a lot of possessions, and Mom didn't exactly have a lot of valuable items in her house, so it was fairly quick going. I figured I would either end up selling or donating most of the crap left behind in the end. Before I knew it, the sun had started setting again. The darkness of a moonless sky descended on Frost Hollow like a guillotine blade. My brother and I kept working, mostly in silence, though Charlie would come over and show me random objects he had recently acquired. "Rick," Charlie said, proudly holding up a plush doll of Rick from Rick and Morty. A trickle of fake drool dripped Rick's mouth, and a trickle of real one from Charlie's. I laughed, ruffling his hair as if he were a toddler. "That's right," I answered excitedly, "that's Rick." "You like Rick, buddy? You like how he just does whatever he wants whenever he feels like?" Charlie nodded excitedly at that. After a couple more hours of sorting, I decided to go to bed. I wanted to leave as early as possible on Sunday morning after the funeral, which was the next day. Charlie followed me like a puppy, his normally unfocused eyes flitting from one side to the other with a kind of intensity one had rarely seen there before. He constantly scanned the shadows, as if looking for something. We kept all the lights in the surrounding rooms and the guest bedroom. As I lay there, about to fall asleep, I glanced over at Charlie and saw him staring straight up at the stain with wide, watery eyes. I don't know how long it was later when I awoke suddenly in the pitch black. I blinked quickly, confused. And then I heard it, the noise that had caused me to sit up in bed. Right over me, I heard something gurgling and hissing in rhythmic breaths. It sounded as if whatever it was had lungs filled with blood and dirt. The terror I felt at that moment was incomprehensible. But it grew much worse when two burning, skeletal hands reached down and grabbed me. They covered my right arm in an iron grip, the thin, blade-like fingers feeling inhumanly long. I could feel my skin burning and melting. I screamed, kicking out with my legs and trying to pull away. I brought my left hand up, grabbing blindly for the thing's face. I groped in the darkness until I felt it, a face like a skull. It was slick and wet under my touch, sticky with clotted blood. I felt the muscles of its skeletal face thrumming and contracting. The thing had no skin. I repressed an urge to scream, instead reaching for its eyes, even as its burning hands continued yanking at my arm, trying to pull me off the bed. I felt a nose that was just a ragged hole of destroyed flesh, felt the fetid breath passing softly through those mutilated patches. I reached up into its eyes, but there were no eyes there, just two empty sockets. I reached inside and felt the skittering of insect larvae under my fingers. At the back of the empty socket, my fingers groped thin strands like fleshy wires that had been severed. With all of my strength, I stuck my finger deep down into that warm, twisting socket, stabbing my fingernails into the optic nerves and vessels at the back and ripping. The hands on my arm instantly released. I felt some of the melted skin go with them, heard the tearing of my flesh as warm blood instantly dripped from the wounds. Hyperventilating, my breath hissing with pain, I fumbled in my pocket for my lighter. I brought it up, flicking it. I caught a glimpse of the thing my brother called the bone-face woman, her naked, skeletal body running out of the room with a sickly gurgling of her diseased lungs. Overhead, the stain had turned into a real eye, a fleshy, black thing that flitted over the arm with a dilated pupil. It emanated insanity, its stare glassy and inhuman. Charlie lay on the floor, his eyes open but unseeing. My breath caught in my throat, the burning agony in my arm temporarily forgotten. I ran toward my brother, kneeling down over his limp body and shaking him. I saw fresh burn marks in the shape of a hand on his face, covering his forehead and temples. The cracked, broken flesh dribbled pus and blood like thick, clotted tears down his cheeks. When he didn't respond, I shook him again, grabbing him by the chin and forcing his eyes to meet mine. I saw him blink. He inhaled like a drowning man, grabbing my hand tightly and shaking his head from side to side. "She was here," he whispered. "She is dead, Dennis. She lives in the dirt. We need to get out of here and never come back," I said, trying to pull Charlie up. He was far too heavy. "Can you get up, buddy? Come on, we'll leave now." With great difficulty, Charlie pulled himself up. His eyes started watering as the weeping burn marks continuously dripped a rainbow of clotted fluids. I took out my phone, trying to call for help, but nothing was working in the house anymore. The electricity had gone off, which was why the lights had all gone out, but that wouldn't explain why my fully charged cell phone had gone black as well. Charlie and I stumbled outside. I put him in the passenger's seat of the car, deciding to get the hell out of there and never come back. But when I tried to turn the starter, the car didn't make a sound. The engine didn't even make an attempt to turn over. "It's her," Charlie whispered, his face a mask of terror and pain in the darkness. "The bone-face woman wants us to stay." "Well, she can go fuck herself," I spat, anger and fear mixing in a toxic sludge in my blood. I watched the house closely, seeing the curtains at the front moving. I caught an occasional glimpse of that abomination peeking out at us with her empty eye sockets and skinned face. I looked at Sloane's house, realizing I could call for help from there. He was the only neighbor within a half-mile radius. "Charlie, the car's not working and I need to call for help. I'm going to go across the street and use Sloane's phone to call the cops. I want you to lock yourself in the car. Don't open the door for anyone except me or the cops. You got that?" I asked, keeping a constant watch on the house, expecting the bone-face woman to slink out after us at any moment. "She is dead," Charlie said robotically. "She is walking. She will not let us leave." After I had made sure Charlie had locked himself in the car, I sprinted over to Sloane's dark Victorian house. I ran up the porch steps, ready to start knocking frantically on the door. But as soon as I touched it, it creaked slowly open, showing a dimly lit kitchen. A single oven light was turned on. I looked around in disgust. The place was filthy. Mold-covered pots and pans covered the stovetop. Drying crusts of filth covered a mountain of dishes emerging from the sink. Maggots and other insects feasted like kings here. The white reflections of glittering rat and mouse eyes peeked out at me from the corners of the room. "Sloane?" I called, not wanting to be too loud. Even though I wouldn't have admitted it to him, I was, quite honestly, terrified of Sloane Herbick. There was something off about that man. I left the kitchen, moving to the living room. There was only a single night light in here. All around me loomed naked human skins nailed to the wall. They rose in 2 rows, the bottom row offset from the top by a few feet so that more of the space could be used. I crept closer with wide eyes, realizing that the vast majority were just latex or silicone. Not all of them, however. Stuck randomly among the fake hanging skins were some that looked different. These looked thicker and had soft ridges running over their surface. I even saw signs of belly buttons, tattoos and nipples on these leathery skins. At that moment, I knew without a doubt that they were human. Many looked ancient and cracked, the leather falling apart at the shoulders or waist. There was a couch covered in what looked like gore in the center of the room facing a TV and DVD player. On a small, wooden table next to it lay a phone and a blood-encrusted meat cleaver. Shaking with excitement and fear, I crept closer to them, immediately grabbing the weapon. I took Sergeant Alvarez's card from my pocket, calling it. She answered on the second ring, sounding tired. "Hello," she said. "Sergeant Alvarez speaking." "This is Dennis Benton," I whispered furtively. "I need help immediately. Send an ambulance and police to my mother's house at 332 Angel Trace Road. Something's happened." "Where are you right now?" she asked. "I'm at my neighbor's across the street, but there's, like, body parts everywhere. I think he might be a serial killer. I don't know what the fuck's going on here, but please, hurry." I gently put the phone back down on the cradle, hearing a floorboard creak behind me. Sloane Herbick stood there, his dark eyes blazing. He pointed a pistol straight at my head. Looking down the barrel felt like looking into eternity. He was wearing a suit made of what looked like pale, white human skin. It covered him from head to foot, hugging his body with precision. All of the thread and sewing marks were expertly hidden. It almost made him look like some strange alien nudist, wearing a suit of white leather. At his feet, he had an open canister of gasoline. With practiced ease, he kicked it over, letting the pungent liquid spill out onto the floor all around me. "Hey man, you don't have to do this," I said, trying to act calm but quivering inside. I expected him to pull the trigger at any second, and then it would be lights out forever. "I've already started," he said, grinning and pointing out the window. I saw my house burning across the street. I felt the blood drain from my face as I thought about Charlie, sitting there in the car with his childlike innocence. I hoped he would know to get out in time. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, horrified. "I never did anything to you." "Everyone who looked at me did something to me," he spat. "They hated me because I'm ugly and burned. But now I have a new skin, so people can't hate me anymore. I made it myself, and this face?" He pointed at the dried human skin wrapping around his head. "This is my mother's. She was one of my first, but she never truly left, you see. She told me, 'Take it. This is my body, given to you. Take my skin, take my face and my hair, and from it, make yourself a new body. Make yourself a thing of beauty, as soft and pale as winter moonlight.' After I killed her, I buried her under the dirt in your house, back when it was being built. I knew they would pour the foundation the next day. All those tons of concrete covered her, took her away, and then no one ever knew what happened." He shrugged. "It had to be done, to make me whole again. No mother could see her own son become a twisted, ugly thing, after all. The rest of the skin mostly came from prostitutes. I find female skin is much softer, more malleable, and easier to work with. They also take better care of their skin than men." He laughed softly at this. "Okay, so you've already finished your suit," I said, sweating heavily. "So let me go. I have nothing to do with this." He smiled an insane rictus grin behind his leathery mask. "I only need one more piece, and that is the soles of the feet," he answered in his cold, psychopathic way. "I'll get those from you. Goodbye, Dennis. It was nice seeing you again." At that moment, Charlie stumbled in the room, his movements loud and ungraceful. Sloane turned, surprised. A heartbeat later, Charlie slammed his heavy body against Sloane's back, sending him flying. The pistol went off, the bullet missing me by inches. I heard it whiz over the top of my head and smash into the ceiling above me. Cold dread worked its way down my spine as I realized I had just missed death by inches. Sloane landed on his stomach at Charlie's feet. Screaming, Sloane put his left hand up, revealing a Zippo lighter there. He flicked it, throwing it at the pile of gasoline. I backpedaled quickly, trying to go around the blazing ball of fire and get to Sloane. "Get the gun!" I screamed at Charlie. Charlie looked down at Sloane with slow comprehension dawning in his face. He took one massive sneaker and stomped down on Sloane's right hand with the pistol in it. I heard the bone crack like twigs snapping. Sloane shrieked, trying to pull away, but Charlie continued leaning down on his arm, preventing him from moving it. The fire was creeping at an incredible rate, rising up the walls and across the ceiling. Thick, black smoke filled the room, suffocating us. I ran at Charlie, my eyes watering. I realized I was still holding the meat cleaver in one hand. I looked down at Sloane in his suit of human skin, still trying to raise the gun with his broken arm. I wanted to finish this quickly. I brought the knife down into the back of his neck, hearing the bone crack. There was a wet thud and a bubbling of blood as the meat cleaver bit deeply into through his spine, and then Sloane was still. "Come on, Charlie," I said, grabbing his large hand. He wrapped his fingers around mine. Coughing and choking, we stumbled out into the night as police cars started pulling up. The first one had Sergeant Alvarez in it, who ran towards us, helping a stumbling Charlie toward the back seat of her car where he could sit down and catch his breath. Both houses were on fire now, blazing pillars of flame that rose high into the black, starless sky. At that moment, I only hoped that the flames would eat away the corpse of Sloane's mother, the bone-faced woman. Story, a run-of-the-mill horror story. Lester and his wife of 10 years, Emily, recently moved into a very large Victorian house in rural Maine. Their marriage had been ripped to shreds by the death of their 5-year-old son, and while they loved each other, they had not been coping well. Lester developed an anger problem, while Emily drank a bottle of wine every night. Seemingly everything reminded them of their late son, and Emily had bad dreams every night about the moment she saw her boy being hit by a pickup truck driven by a bigoted man in his 40s. One night, Lester found himself unable to sleep, and wound up sitting on the edge of his bed staring into the wall as if something was about to crawl out of it. Emily could not sleep either, but she remained lying on her side with her eyes half open. "Lester, what are you doing?" "It's 2 a.m. Lester groaned and lit up a cigarette. "I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what went wrong with our Toby. I couldn't run fast enough, despite going on 4-mile runs every morning." Emily sat up and stared at her husband. "Why are you smoking?" "Because I have writer's block," Lester barked. "I am a somewhat recognizable novelist who publishes a whole book every 7 years, but these days, I can hardly string together a few sentences. Trust me, I know all about disappointment. As a stay-at-home painter, I sell 1 piece a month, and I have depression. Still, we can afford this beautiful home," so why their conversation was promptly cut off by a loud thud coming from the hallway. They looked up in silence before another thud rang out. Lester put on his slippers and bolted towards the door. "What are you doing?" asked Emily. "What do you think?" "I'm going to go see what that sound was." He almost went to the closet for his gun, but then he realized that a weapon would not be conceivably useful in that sort of situation. He figured that if there was something out there, he could yell loud enough for it to run away. So, he simply cleared his mind and exited the room. Lester stepped carefully down the hallway before noticing that a door to his right was open. He knew he closed that door before going to bed, so he thought this was strange. Still, without a second thought, he entered the room and closed the door behind him. The room was pitch black, but he did not think to turn on the lights. Instead, he retrieved a cigarette lighter from the pocket of his sweatpants and flicked it on. From the other end of the room, he heard a faint growling sound. He thought that it must be a dog that the previous homeowners left behind, so he approached it without hesitation. With each step, the growling got louder and louder, but this did not deter him. He thought this dog must have been starving, so he bravely pushed on. When he got closer, lightning flashed and he could not believe what was illuminated. It was not a dog at all, but rather, an alien. He realized that this made a lot of sense in that it did not really need to make sense. It was an alien, so that was all he needed to know. The alien reached out, and both of them disappeared. The next morning, Emily decided to move back to New York City. She did not attempt to sell the house nor pack any of her things. She just got in her modest sedan and drove away, crying as the trees passed by. Story, barn loft, horror story. I stopped counting the days after I got around 15. I would have kept going, but I couldn't. I had lost all hope. We stopped wondering if jumping down to escape was an option after watching 2 boys try to make a break for it. They injured their legs so bad, they couldn't get up, and we watched and dragged them away from our sight. We didn't see them again. One by one, the companions I had made came and went, until some of them stopped coming back to the loft altogether. They had been there longer than me, but I knew my time to go where they went was coming soon. Whenever I heard his ladder clang against the loft, I panicked, only remembering to breathe when I wasn't next. Normally when the ones who were taken came back, they never said anything more than a few mutters about experiments. They stayed like that, unmoving, barely talking, until they were taken down again. One girl was able to tell a bit more about what had happened. He would take them into a room that looked almost like one at a hospital, strap them down onto a table, and put an IV into their veins, which coursed an unknown substance into them. He said it would change them. There was more she wasn't telling us, and I couldn't tell if she'd stopped talking because she couldn't remember or just didn't want to relive it. We never knew his motive until it was evident that a couple who had come back had noticeably changed. The look in their eyes was wilder, they moved in awkward, jerky movements, they weren't human anymore. The rest of us stayed far away from them for as long as we could, unsure of the better option, becoming them or disappearing forever. We didn't have a choice, but the thought of one or the other was almost as terrifying as our situation. It wasn't hard to pick up on his schedule. He might have been mad, but he was methodical. The plan was to wait for him to leave with his tray of tools, none of which I recognized. He always took a long time to clean them. We didn't know exactly where that was, only that it was outside the barn. I didn't know whether to be anxious or flattered that he took the time to clean them up before using them on his next experiment. After he had left with the tray, we were to crawl out the hole in the wall where multiple kids had unknowingly teamed up to tear away at the old boards of the wall when he wasn't there. It wasn't very noticeable on the inside, because we'd just put the boards in front of the hole and hide it. Even though he kept us in a loft, making it so we couldn't jump down on the inside, the outside proved to be easier. Through the hole, we were able to see a small roof right there that we would be able to get on to use to get onto the ground. I wasn't as optimistic as everyone else. I had almost started to look forward to my turn with him and wanted to know what would happen. I was still terrified of him, though. I saw what the stuff did in the IV did to the others before they were killed or turned into a mutant. It wasn't something to look forward to, but what else was I supposed to hope for when escape hadn't been an option? When the time came to execute our plan, I may have actually felt a twinge of optimism, though I found myself saying it wasn't going to work. But, after all that time of being here, watching everyone around me disappear, maybe I was finally getting out. We uncovered the hole and the first person went through. Everything was going as well as it could. Until that first person on the outside fell through the roof we were supposed to get on. In a panic, someone else went out, too, maybe to see if it was possible to avoid falling through as well. They didn't and managed to lower themselves enough to safely jump onto the ground. This gave the rest of us hope. However, the crash of someone falling through the roof had not gone unnoticed. He was back inside now, yelling. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but I didn't need to. I was buzzing with so many thoughts and feelings, my blood turned cold as I realized this may not work. The sound of his footsteps urged us to get on with the next kid's escape. The clang of his ladder caused us to scramble to get through the hole before he could make it up there. I got through and saw the opening in the roof that had been left from the first escapee. It was barely avoidable, but the ones who went out before me had went around it and made it to the ground. I could, too. All I had to do was lower myself onto the ground. Even though they could have already run off, the ones who had made it out first waited, arms open, ready to catch me. It all happened so fast. I was pushed before I could figure out how to get down fast enough without hurting myself. I fell onto the people below me and someone else fell on top of me. It just had to be one of the mutants who had pushed me, now crushing me between them and the people underneath me. We were disoriented, the sunlight was blinding and the sounds of nature suddenly around us overwhelming. Our limbs were a tangled mess. I couldn't tell my arms and legs from the people I landed on or the mutant kid weighing down on me. I heard words of praise and the mutant's weight lifted from my body. I thought we were free until I saw him. He caught us before anyone could make a move to get up. Bye and see you again in the next videos and stories.